Hello and welcome to the IDEA Handbook webinar series. These webinars accompany the release of the new Handbook on Using Administrative Data for Research and Evidence-Based Policy, funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. The Handbook provides a series of technical guides and case studies on how to make administrative data more accessible for research and policy analysis. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Kelsey Jack, who will be presenting a chapter titled City of Cape Town, South Africa, Aligning Internal Data Capabilities with External Research Partnerships. We selected the City of Cape Town as one of our case studies because it is a municipal government that in 2016 made a very deliberate choice of making data more accessible, and since then has taken a very thoughtful approach to following through on this goal. The city, among other things, instituted a new data policy that emphasized the value of data as a public good. And this has led to a productive cooperation between the city and several academic researchers to create systematic data access. Our presenter today is Kelsey Jack. Kelsey is an associate professor of environmental and development economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the co-chair for environment, energy, and climate change at JPAL. She has conducted research in Cape Town for many years. Her co-authors are Hugh Cole, Bren Maughan-Brown, and Derek Strong. Hugh Cole has been Director of Policy and Strategy at the City of Cape Town since 2017, and before that he was the Country Program Director at the International Growth Centre in London. Bren Maughan-Brown is the Research Advisor at JPAL Africa and serves as a Chief Research Officer at the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit of the University of Cape Town, where he conducts public health research with a focus on HIV. And last but not least, Derek Strong is currently a research computing associate with the Center for Advanced Research Computing at the University of Southern California. And prior to this, he worked with Kelsey at UC Santa Barbara and with the City of Cape Town on creating this administrative data access that this chapter is covering.
Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Kelsey Jack. I'm an associate professor at University of California at Santa Barbara, and I'm going to present the case study on aligning internal data capabilities with external research partnerships, a case study of the City of Cape Town. My co-authors, Hugh Cole and Derek Strong, will be able to join during the question and answer. Bren Maughan-Brown, unfortunately, will not be able to join us, but I hope that you'll stick around so that we can have a little bit of active engagement. I'll give a little bit of background, and in many ways, what we think is some of the most interesting characteristics of this case study come from the motivations of the different actors involved and the background to how this collaboration really came about. I'll talk through a couple of data use examples and then speak a bit more broadly about how this particular case study highlights some of the important reasons for using administrative data for research, and in particular, the kind of template or framework that has emerged from the shared needs of researchers and the municipal government in Cape Town, South Africa. This is very much a work in progress. City of Cape Town is actively trying to continue to push forward on resolving some of these things with the support of JPAL and researchers. So everything that I say today is subject to change. The authors involved, just to give you a little bit of initial background. So Hugh Cole has really been the guiding force in the City of Cape Town. He's the Director of Policy and Strategy. And sits in the mayor's office. I'm Kelsey Jack. I already introduced myself, and I'll say a little bit more about how I got involved in a moment. Derek Strong is currently at the University of Southern California. He spent a year working with the partners on this project, traveling back and forth between UCSB and Cape Town, South Africa, supporting many of the technical aspects, but also really creating some of the overarching vision and contributing the researcher's perspective. And Bren Maughan-Brown has been leading this work from within JPAL Africa as a research advisor, and also as somebody very involved in the IDEA initiative in the Africa office. This case study is really brought together by sort of this merging of two different perspectives. On the one hand, the city of Cape Town as really the producer of large and fairly well organized administrative data sets, and researchers on the other hand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these two different perspectives and how we were able to find sort of complementarities and some areas of alignment. The City of Cape Town is a municipal government. It falls under all of the kind of jurisdictional arrangements that are common in South Africa. It's a democratically elected local government for about 4 million people who live in Cape Town. And one of the interesting things about the City of Cape Town's responsibilities is that they're responsible for most of the service provision. So public services, including electricity, water, sanitation, refuse, transportation, housing, emergency services, primary health care, environmental health, community development. You can see these here, but this includes a lot of administrative roles that in other countries would not necessarily be taken on by the local government. In this case, for example, the City of Cape Town is purchasing electricity from the national grid and distributing it to residents in Cape Town and managing the budget associated with that, managing revenue recovery, etc. This, of course, as you can start to anticipate, gives rise to some very rich administrative data sets, many of which are linked via the citizens of Cape Town. So residents have accounts, and those can serve as a way of linking some of these different administrative sources. We'll come back to that. The most unique part of the perspective and kind of motivation of the City of Cape Town is its commitment to evidence-based policymaking and importantly, leveraging data for effective governance. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this chapter, but importantly, in 2016, the city underwent a fairly dramatic restructuring that really laid the groundwork for everything I'm going to be talking about today. And as the City of Cape Town looked at different municipalities around the world, one of the things that just stood out again and again is the fact that successful municipalities, well-run municipalities, leverage the data they generate in order to inform their own policymaking processes. So this really rose to the top as a priority for the City of Cape Town that facilitated things like the creation of Hugh Cole's position and his hiring at the time. On the flip side, JPAL Africa and UC Santa Barbara's kind of background and engagement, we represent sort of the research side of this, and we were engaged in various collaborations with the City of Cape Town that relied on administrative data. I'll talk about one of those in just a moment. And these collaborations really revealed the strength of CCT is going to be the abbreviation here for the City of Cape Town. Their administrative data, but also some shortcomings, some areas for improvement. Among other things, in addition to the data content itself, these collaborations really highlighted some of the challenges of sharing data from the municipality to researchers, but also vice versa, researchers reciprocating and returning finished products, whether in the form of cleaned up data sets or in the form of research findings back to city officials. Interestingly, one of the things that we realized as we started engaging more seriously with people at different levels within the City of Cape Town is that the same challenges that we're facing researchers from the outside, we're also facing researchers and data analysts within the municipal government. So some of these challenges of understanding what data even exists, of accessing the data, et cetera, that we from the outside were running up against, it turned out that people internally were facing those exact same issues. So some of what really came out of this collaboration is the ability to realize that the same solutions that could help the city government find ways to leverage their own data more effectively were also the solutions that would allow them to engage more regularly and at a lower cost with external researchers who might be able to shed some light on some of the interesting challenges that the city faces. Let me talk briefly about two concrete data examples in just a moment that I think will really help solidify some of these ideas. Before I do, just one more word on kind of this confluence of two perspectives. So what this case study describes is a process for trying to capitalize on the shared interests and goals of researchers and city officials. And in particular, three that sort of highlight and guide everything that we go through in the chapter are, one, the goal of lowering the time burden of identifying, standardizing, and actually sharing data sets. So again, this is a goal both for data sharing within the city so that researchers on the policy side can be understanding what's being generated, use what's being generated, access what's being generated for internal research purposes, but also with researchers outside of the city. And so obviously those are going to give rise to slightly different challenges. At the same time, to improve the security, transparency, and reciprocity of data sharing relationships. So as I said, the need for researchers not to just be a one-way kind of recipients of data, but also to be sharing the fruits of the effort that we put in. And then finally, to be identifying opportunities for research, both by internal and external researchers, to contribute to policy. And importantly, of course, the first two things on this list, really facilitating the third one. All right, the promised data use examples. So there are three cases that the chapter goes through in a bit of detail. What I'm going to do is talk mostly about the first one, because that's the one that I know best. Talk briefly about the second one, and then at the end of this presentation, we'll come back to the third, which is very much an ongoing data use example in many ways. So the first data use example is a project that I was involved in starting, I think, in about 2014, where we were interested in understanding the impacts of what are called prepaid electricity meters. This is a research collaboration with external researchers. The other two that I'll touch on are internal examples of research collaboration. The question, just to kind of set the stage, was to understand how prepaid electricity metering, basically think of this as a prepaid cell phone, but it's your electricity meter, how that affected residential use and City of Cape Town costs and revenue, relative to a counterfactual, which was postpaid metering, or what you might think of as monthly billing, sort of standard ways of receiving electricity. Now, Cape Town, like the rest of South Africa, has a large share of its residential customers already on prepaid electricity metering. And what we were able to do, and I'll say who we is in just a second here, what we were able to do is take advantage of a meter replacement program that the city was running to say, could we evaluate it? Could we use that as an opportunity to design a randomized controlled trial where instead of just replacing meters in whatever kind of ad hoc way was most convenient, instead we worked very closely with the city and with the contractors who were actually doing the meter replacements to make sure that there was adherence to a randomization protocol that allowed us to really evaluate these impacts of prepaid metering, and importantly, impacts that the city was deeply concerned about or very, very interested in, how this affected costs and revenue. There was an iterative process for actually figuring out how to design this that relied very heavily on administrative data so that we could work around some of the logistical constraints and we could use information about customers, use information about geography to design the randomized trial in the first place. This required data from multiple sources. On the one hand, we were looking at a transition from monthly billing to prepaid metering. These are run by the City of Cape Town through two completely different administrative data systems. On the one hand, the billing data is coming from a SAP system, a very standard way for governments to run billing systems. On the other hand, the vending data associated with prepaid electricity metering was a point of sale system that aggregated up information from the actual purchase points that customers were using. To connect all of this, we needed GIS data on the actual properties. That's how we were able to link a billing meter, a postpaid meter, to a prepaid meter. And then also data from the contractors to know when installations were happening, whether they were happening. And again, as I said, we needed to have these types of data both at the design phase, but also as our outcome data. So we could see when people were paying for their electricity, how much electricity they were consuming, etc. These were all the things that we wanted to study, all of which relied on administrative data sources. This collaboration really highlighted some data challenges. My co-author and I worked very, very closely with the electricity department throughout this study. But the data flow was quite complicated. We had to be collaborating with different units within the city. We had to be collaborating with the contractor. And this required a lot of in-person interactions to facilitate transfers of data, to understand the details of the data. It was a very time-consuming investment from both sides. The institutional setup behind this was it built on an existing research relationship between the City of Cape Town's electricity department and a PhD student at the University of Cape Town named Grant Smith. Grant had been working with the electricity department for some time and had an existing data use agreement with them. I was able to come in and join that existing data use agreement without having to dramatically modify it. And so the fact that there was this existing relationship was extremely important. Had this not existed, I think it would have taken a very long time, and we certainly would have missed this opportunity to be able to set up kind of a formal research relationship. So one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is some investments on both sides to try to streamline this process and make more transparent this process for allowing researchers to even engage in the first place. The result of this is a recent publication that highlights the impact evaluation, and just because I know you're all just dying to know what we found, this is a very quick summary. On the left, what you see is the impact on electricity consumption. So to the left of this vertical line, this is consumption on a postpaid meter. It's zero because this is kind of the measure of the treatment effect. And then it falls by about 2 kilowatt hours per household per day, or about 14% of what postpaid billing electricity consumption actually looked like. On the right side, what you see is the net revenue, or revenue minus cost. We don't really want to think about it as profit because there are a lot of other pieces going into this, but what you can see from this is that there's a lot of kind of heterogeneity. Different types of customers have very different payoffs from switching them from postpaid billing to prepaid metering. This was certainly of interest to the City of Cape Town to understand which types of customers to target, which types of customers yield the highest gains from transitioning them to prepaid metering. It's also a set of findings that are of direct interest to other municipal decision makers or electricity providers around the world. You can look at the paper if you want to know more. Our job is to talk about the research collaboration, not the specific findings here. So with that in mind, let me move on to a second example of using administrative data for decision making, more in this case from a policy perspective. The second example here is the use of administrative data for policymaking and internal purposes, internal collaborations between the policy side and the sources of administrative data. This was an example from the 2017-2018 drought. You may remember hearing in the news, for example, about day zero, this threat of having to actually shut down the municipal water sources in Cape Town because drought had lowered the water table, or the available water, so dramatically. The City of Cape Town had this policy challenge of how to manage this extreme drought. The data needs in this case were largely internal. Of course, there's research that's happened since then, but in the midst of the crisis, the challenge was, how do we keep track of what's actually going on? How do we share across different sources of information and different sources of data? How do we leverage these to communicate with the public about what's actually going on, both for the purpose of facilitating behavior, but also to avoid kind of a lot of mistrust, a lot of sort of making it too political, and then importantly also to leverage it for water management, which was done very successfully, including things like managing water pressure throughout the system, improving infrastructure, basically using the data to help guide investments that in turn lowered aggregate water use. The data challenges here were extreme, in particular this need for very real-time data sharing across departments. between contractors who in many cases were managing the infrastructure in the city of Cape Town, making sure that things were spatially explicit so that the investments could be happening at the right time and in the right place, and also so that citizens could have access to information that was relevant for them, that was sort of local to their particular neighborhood. The outcome, happily, of this very massive effort, and I'm not going to go into this in as much detail as I did with the previous data use example, was a massive decline in water use. So water use fell over a 3-year period by about 50%, which is just huge compared to other cities, other municipalities that have had these kinds of water crises. This is faster and a larger magnitude than we've seen in California, in Melbourne, and Sao Paulo, other places that have had these kinds of threats. This allowed the city of Cape Town to avoid day zero, at least in that instance. One example of how they were using data, you can see this is a water dashboard that the city created in the midst of the crisis so that consumers could, or customers, citizens could go access the information on what was actually going on. This is aggregating information about how much water is actually being used in real time, about dam levels. This window on the right has been retired, it appears, but at the time being able to see by different breakouts of customer characteristics, of location, other things like that, how water use was actually going. This is credited for helping to really change behavior, rally citizens behind the efforts of the city. So with these data use examples in mind, and some of the challenges that they helped highlight, I'm going to move on to talking a little bit more about the particulars of the efforts that are ongoing within the city, and then we'll return to the current COVID crisis and how data is being managed there. So the goal here is to improve some of these processes that these types of data use examples have really highlighted. So making administrative data sets more accessible, both for internal and external data analytics research evaluation. The challenges that we could highlight, thinking about kind of the status quo, which I think in the city of Cape Town are very similar to what we see around the world. And in fact, City of Cape Town data systems are pretty well managed. So in many cases, these status quo challenges are less severe than they might be in other settings. But these include the fact that administrative data is not generated for research purposes. As we know, it's generated to help run the city in this case. And so it's coming from this variety of different sources, none of which have been designed explicitly to facilitate linking across them, to facilitate common storage systems, to facilitate common identifiers. And in addition, there are different data stewards involved. So very different people tasked with managing the data sets who have sort of different ideas about the goals and the purposes and how they should best be set up and managed. So I've talked about some of these already: electricity and water, billing, transportation. There's a whole GIS department. These data stewards, again, are not always concerned first and foremost with making data accessible to researchers. So the more the time burden and the more the effort that they have to exert to make these data available, the less likely it's going to be that it's done in a timely or way or updated with any kind of regularity. Another status quo challenge is how easy it is to find data, how accessible the data are, how well they can speak to each other, how well data sets can be replicated. These are all things that through these data use examples became very clear, needed further standardization, needed further work. And then very importantly, of course, is maintaining anonymity and security of any kind of restricted use data, even within the city. So this is true certainly for external users, but it's even true in many cases for internal users who don't necessarily have the level of security or the level of access needed. This broad framework, which I'll go through it in a little bit of detail, is an effort to summarize the current approach to resolving these challenges. This goes all the way from, reading it from left to right, the process of initially identifying data sets, requesting access to those data sets, all the way through the need for greater reciprocity for researchers, whether it's internal or external, to be sharing information back, to be sharing findings back with the data stewards, with those who created the data in the first place. You can see in moving down vertically, this is split between researchers, the policy and strategy research branch, which is where Hugh sits, and the data science team, which I haven't talked about, but are very crucial players within the City of Cape Town's efforts to come up with a long-run solution. And in addition, the data stewards from the relevant departments. I'm going to go through this working from left to right and say a little bit more about what's involved in trying to come up with these solutions and to actually implement them. So first, from the researcher's side, and this is an important part of what the city is trying to do, is to really streamline this approach to requesting data, to accessing data, and so on, both so that it lowers the time burden internally for City of Cape Town, but also so that it levels the playing field, so that it makes data more accessible, so that we don't have to be quite so dependent on things like my prior relationship with Grant Smith, which really allowed me to have access, for me to know what types of data were available. But if I had just walked in kind of out of the blue, I never would have had that kind of access. So this involves a streamlined, standardized web-based application, which until recently did not exist, where researchers can describe the data that they need, can describe their research questions. Then the City of Cape Town reviews those on a rolling basis. They apply some screening criteria for trying to evaluate what type of access that researcher should be able to have, whether it's only anonymized aggregate data, or whether it's actually data that includes identifiers, which in many cases end up being necessary to link across data sets. Then once the decision on access comes through, the researcher, of course, is signing some kind of data use agreement, non-disclosure agreement. One important innovation that the City of Cape Town has been coming up with is more template data use agreements, so that there's not as much effort put into kind of bespoke agreements that vary from researcher to researcher, that slow down the process quite a bit. And then at the same time, what you can see happening across the bottom here is work on the data science team to work with the data stewards to make sure that this process of when a request comes in from a researcher, again, whether internal or external, this particular diagram is largely describing external researchers' processes, but then the data stewards have some data pipelines in place so that, again, it's not like every researcher is getting sort of a customized data set, but rather that there's a process for the most commonly used, the most commonly requested types of data being piped into a common data sharing platform. So that's what this upload data to data portal is referring to, is that moving even further to the right, the process will look like then data is being populated on a data portal. It's being either aggregated, de-identified, going through whatever necessary processes are there. And then the researcher has an account on this data portal and is only given access to the data sets that were covered on this data use agreement, on this research permission application, where that researcher has been granted access to a particular data set. Then once those steps have happened internally, the researcher can log on to this data portal and access the data that they have been granted access to. At the same time, this data portal can help manage the process for maintaining research permissions, for ensuring that researchers in turn are sharing back with the city their findings. It's a two-way process where researchers can also upload code, can also upload cleaned up data sets so that others can access them, again, who have permission to access them. And it can increase transparency and replicability dramatically relative to the status quo. The ability to implement this type of very radical reform to the process for accessing and sharing and using administrative data builds on this very unique framework. So all of this would be absolutely impossible without a couple of kind of enabling conditions. And those rest largely in two documents that have come out of this restructuring that I described, began in 2016. The policy foundation comes from both a data strategy document that was drafted and accepted by the City of Cape Town and a research framework document. So between the two of these, this really lays the groundwork for kind of all of the effort that's been going on here. The data strategy lays out the data management process, approaches to lowering the cost of sharing and combining data sets across sources, and importantly, creates specific roles so that when we look at that sort of flow chart that I just showed you, it's very clear who's leading, who's managing different aspects of it. Again, as I mentioned, the data science team is very crucial for creating the technical solutions along the way, for having the sort of technical knowledge to ensure that privacy, confidentiality, et cetera, is maintained, and that the process of approving a researcher to access certain things, that flows all the way through to kind of the final step of that researcher having obligations to transmit information back to the city. The research framework clarifies procedures for sharing data with external partners. It updates research management practices. And again, it stresses this kind of reciprocity, the exchange of value, and prioritizes research that will inform policy. So these two documents between them really create this kind of enabling environment for the kinds of reforms that are currently underway in the city. Some of the solutions have looked like investment in people. So the city has created a chief data officer, it's created this data science team, it's created a unit called organizational policy and planning, many others. In some cases, it's looked like investment in technology and infrastructure. So the data sharing platform that I mentioned, the current inception of it is using a sort of data library software called CCAN. It has looked like investment in secure downloading and uploading. It's looked like investment in metadata standards and populating the metadata for some of the most commonly accessed and used data sets in the city. It's also looked like APIs to populate the platform. So these pipelines that I described so that data stewards could more readily transmit data to CCAN without having to do this in a sort of every single instance is a new task. This is with this very clear goal of reducing the time burden for data stewards. And also the data sharing process, so investments in that, revising the workflows and standard operating procedures, and importantly, coming up with a data inventory. So even the data that has not already been loaded onto CCAN, researchers can be aware that it exists. So currently over 1,000 kind of research relevant data sets have been identified through this inventorying process with the goal of populating metadata so that it's searchable even before the pipelines are ready to go. As I said, all of this is very ambitious. This is a work in progress. That said, researchers are accessing data as we speak through the CCAN platform. The template data use agreements are being sort of finalized as we speak. So this process is fairly far along, but like all things, like all good things, it's subject to change and to various disruptions. COVID-19 has certainly slowed things down. There was a lot of momentum going into it. But at the same time, this crisis that we're currently living through has really highlighted the importance of remote data sharing. So the third data use example that I put up at the beginning of this was highlighting how important the ability to access remote data sets and to have a secure place so that internally the City of Cape Town can be accessing information from health, from housing, from transportation, from all of these different sources, and including what this has started to push the City of Cape Town toward is sharing not just internally, but also across different levels of government. So there's been a use of the CCAN platform to communicate between, for example, the state government, the provincial government in this case, and the city government. These types of uses could very well continue, really highlighting the benefit of systematizing these types of challenges, both to solve the research policy interface, but also to solve different levels of policy and decision making so that data can be better leveraged in the policy process. Let me stop there. If you have comments, questions, etc., I've put up all of our email addresses. There'll be some time for Q&A, and thanks so much for your time and attention.